Welcome to the In Conversation show. I'm your host Mansoor Soomro. In this episode, we're meeting Adele Parks. Adele is the author of 22 best-selling novels, including the recent Sunday Times #1 hits Lies, Lies, Lies and Just My Luck. Over 4.5 million UK editions of her work has been sold, and her books have been translated in over 31 different languages. In 2022, she was awarded an MBE, a British Order of Chivalry, for services to the literature. Adele.
Hello.
You're amazing.
Thank you.
Welcome to the In Conversation show.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Likewise. What is a good story?
Oh, well, everybody knows a story has to have a beginning, middle, and end, which is why I think we all have stories in us, but not necessarily the old, you know the phrase, everybody has a book in them. I'm not sure we do, but because we don't have neat beginning, middles, and ends, but we definitely have stories within us. And I think those stories are really about what it means to connect, to be human, to find empathy in other people. And I think that's why I started reading, certainly, and why I started writing. I wanted to talk about my experiences and say, does anybody else ever feel these things? I wanted to look at other people's experiences and say, perhaps they're not as alien. Maybe we can all relate. So I think a good story is something about empathy, but it's also definitely about a structure, this thing about beginning, middle, and end, because I think that's more entertaining rather than a sort of splodge, which is what our real lives are.
Fantastic. Well said. Right. So that's a good story, right? Extending that point, I mean, how do you define a good writer? With that thought, you know, the perspective of empathy and structure that you talked about.
With writers, there's tools. First of all, you know, you use a sentence structure, vocabulary, syntax, all of those things. And you can go to university and do a master's in learn creativity and learn how to express your creativity. And I think those things are all incredibly important because they're the tools of our trade. But I think another aspect to, you know, another aspect to being a good writer is trying to look at something in a different way to how everybody else looks at it. So whilst we are, I think, looking for empathy and understanding and connection between human beings, it has to be fresh enough for people to suddenly think, oh, yes, that is how I feel. I hadn't been able to articulate it myself. Now you've said it, I feel a little bit more comfortable with the world. And I think good writers make us feel a little bit more comfortable.
I see. Adele, I have to ask you this. Do you really believe in writer's block?
I do not.
You know, and for our learners, you know, this condition that, you know, there are days when you're not able to write, right? So the thoughts are not flowing, and the creative part of me, there's a slowdown on that. Do you believe in that writer's block?
Yeah, I genuinely believe there are days that I'm not as good as the other days. And I absolutely accept that some writers believe in writer's block, the way, you know, we all have different views on everything, and that's brilliant, we should. So I'm not negating anyone else's belief in it. But for me personally, I think writer's block is quite a sort of fancy excuse, a fancy term that only writers are given and nobody else is given it. So I think it just means on days you're not feeling 100% yourself, you're not feeling as good at what you do, you might be feeling a bit lazier, you might be feeling a little bit depressed, you might be feeling a lack of confidence. But you know what? That happens in every job. But we don't say, oh, let's have a day off because I've got solicitor's block or doctor's block or nurse's block. You know, those things don't exist, you know. I once said that and I said, oh, builder's block. And someone said, no, builder's block does exist.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, but a builder's block is something completely different. But I mean, all those other professions, those people will have days where they don't feel as confident, as healthy and happy about their jobs. Teachers, whoever they are, but they need to go in and do their job because other people are depending on them. Now, I think with writing, because actually we're only sort of depended on a couple of times a year when we have to hand something in to our editors, we have a little bit more of an excuse to say, oh, I don't feel like it today. And somehow that has developed into this sort of rather lofty idea that it's writer's block, but I don't hold any truck with it. And I do think, so I'm from Teesside, I do think it's quite a northern approach that I have, that I'm just like, get the work done, just get it done. And so no matter how I'm feeling, and trust me, there are days that I really don't want to write and I don't feel I'm doing my best writing, but I always do write 1,000 to 2,000 words. If later on in the process I decide they're rubbish and they have to be ditched, fine. But I don't allow myself to step away from that desk because experience has shown me that if I do it one day, what's stopping me doing it the next day and the next day and the next day? And pretty soon, you're not a writer, you're somebody who talks about being a writer. And actually, on a similar line, I don't really believe in the muse, which is another excuse writers are given. They're you know, again, for the audience, we talk about the muse visiting and sort of, oh, I can't be creative today, the muse hasn't visited. I always said, well, I've written 22 books in 22 years and our son is also 22 years old. So my muse must have also been a working mum because she very much turned up school hours, bless her heart. By which I mean, you know, you can't really shrug it off and wait for someone else to inspire you and sort of say, oh, it's a magical process. I personally believe it's, you know, 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. That isn't me, that's a quote. I think it's Edison who said that, yeah.
Lovely, brilliant. I mean, that's interesting, and your perspective and the way you balanced it. Taking it further, I mean, how do you explore ideas when you write these books, right? How do you sketch the plots? How do you bring up the creative side to the max?
Yeah, I mean, ideas come in all sorts of ways, shapes and forms. Sometimes an idea, and this is a joy when this happens, sometimes an idea comes bang, and you just know that's what I'm writing about. And I can give you a specific example of that.
That would be great, yeah.
You mentioned in the introduction one of my books, Just My Luck, and that's a book about a lottery win. And what happened is I was at a friend's birthday lunch and I was sat next to a very old friend of mine who at that time was the financial director at Camelot, which at that time was the lottery, you know, they run the lottery. And I said, oh, come on, you must have some great stories about the winners and the reactions. And he started telling me the stories and they were fun, as you'd imagine. And then just as a sort of throwaway comment, he said, and also obviously quite a lot of these winners are not used to having a lot of money and they have it very suddenly. They might have nothing and then suddenly tens of millions, maybe 100 million. So obviously we need to help them, and so we point them in the direction of independent financial advisors because obviously they can't get involved with the financial advisors. And I thought, oh yeah, okay. And then he said, and obviously security because their children go on a kidnap risk list. And I thought, that's the story. That's the story none of us ever know about. We all think winning the lottery is winning the lottery, all your dreams come true. But actually what he just told me is one of your worst nightmares. It just lands. The minute you win the lottery, your children are at risk. Where anyone who's a parent knows you spend your entire life trying to stop your children being at risk. So I thought that's the story, not really about the win, but about the trouble that comes with the win. And we were at this party and I said to my husband, oh, we've got to leave now. And he was like, why? I said, I haven't got a pen, I haven't got any paper, and I might forget this idea. We need to leave. So that's the joy when the days, and I think that's happened out of the 22 books, I would say that's happened a handful of times, 3, 4, 5 times. All the rest, the ideas have come as a much more organic, slower process. So it's much more likely that I'll hear somebody mention something. I don't know, they might mention, they might mention somebody they know who's having trouble getting pregnant. And then someone else mentions that, and then someone else mentions that, and I think, this is the zeitgeist moment at the moment, this is what people are talking about. I write psychological thrillers, so I write a darker side of life. So I remember there being in the news quite a lot about sex tapes and revenge porn, and I remember thinking, there must be a novel in that. Then, when I have a theme, such as something like that, I will spend weeks, if not months, asking myself questions about what that plot might be and what the twists would be and what I'm going to tell my characters, what I'm going to tell my readers, and what I'm going to hold back for myself.
This is before you actually
Before
start
I'm
writing.
Yes, this is all still in my head. I don't even write at this stage. I don't even write it.
Rigorous thought process.
It is, and at this stage, I personally don't even write it in a notebook. It is just in my head, and I think, this could happen. Oh no, that's silly. Or this could happen. Yeah, that's really good. But if it did, who would it happen to? And then I start sort of playing it out. And then I write, I draw a very old-fashioned spidergram. And I don't know if you remember that being taught about those at school, but you sort of have an idea in a circle at the centre and sort of points going off. And children do these to help their creativity, and adults do these to help their creativity. And I might have sort of characters going off in different directions, and then how do those characters relate to each other, and what happens to them, and who's in that scene. And it starts to get quite big, and there will come a point where that paper's too full and it becomes a bit chaotic. And at that stage, I'll write a much more linear sort of chapter 1, 2, 3, 4. Usually there's about 40 chapters in my book, and I'll start drafting out what will happen in each chapter. And at that point, I've probably been thinking about this book for 3 or 4 months. And then, when I'm absolutely desperate, I will start writing. And I've found that, going back to your question about writer's block, this rigorous sort of thought process of knowing where I'm going to go makes every word count. And therefore, I'm less likely to fall into this trap of thinking, what can I do today? And I always deliver 1,000 to 2,000 words every working day.
That's a fantastic approach, from the spidergram, then, first thinking about it, then putting it on paper in terms of the visual illustration and sort.
It works for me.
Filtering it.
And you know what?
fantastic.
Everybody has a different way.
Yes,
I have other author friends who are, equally prolific, equally successful, and they might put sort of sticky notes on their wall and then move those around. I have others that start writing and they say, I don't know where it's going. I don't know what's going to happen. That would terrify me, but that's what works for them. And I think that's a very special thing about being creative. There isn't a right or wrong way about being creative. I've just found over the years, 22 published books in 22 years, the 23rd will be this year. Over that period of time, that's the process I personally have honed down.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Pleasure.
The process. All right. So, taking it further, how can one be a best-selling author? I come from business school, right? So, give me a idiot's guide to it, right? So, these are the 3 steps. These are the 5 steps. To make it simple, in terms of.
Well, okay. Best-selling is you get that title. You're supposed to get that title if you're in the top 10 Sunday Times list. Because the Sunday Times is an actual physical measure of how many books were sold that week, how many physical, real live books, whether that's hardback or paperback. But actually, you'll see a lot of people now they might be an ebook bestseller or an audiobook bestseller. Again, it's sort of hitting a threshold. How do you do that? Well, can I tell you, it's not a one-person show. It really isn't. You become a bestseller because of a team of experts. And I 100% believe that. I've been incredibly lucky to work with phenomenal professionals, editors, agents, designers, because actually Whether a book is picked up or not quite depends on what's on the front of that cover. We're not supposed to judge a book by a cover. We absolutely do. So sort of the people in the publishing house, that might be the marketeers, the publicists that will get my name out there and weave a story about what I'm doing, so people think, you know, they'll read about me in newspapers and they'll pick it, they'll go out and look for it. And so that's almost quite obvious that the publishing house is part of the best-selling process. But it goes much further than that. The best-selling process is also about librarians. It's about the people in the shops, in the sort of supermarkets, in the WH Smiths, in the Waterstones, in the Independents, who like a book and tell somebody else, this is a good one, read this. Who put it on the shelves appropriately, quick enough, and when it sells out, they buy it again. They do their job well. It's about bloggers and reviewers, and most of all, it's about the readers. You become a bestseller if a reader recommends you one. And whether that's them writing a review on Goodreads or Amazon or any of the other places you can review books, or whether that's just pushing their copy on to somebody else and saying, you must read this, it really worked for me. Whatever that is, it really is the reader that makes you the bestseller. It's not me. It's all of us, yeah.
I mean, you said it well. I mean, there's so much that goes into it, right?
Yes,
so, I mean,
it's a process. It's
in
a
terms of
supply
the stakeholders
chain.
and supply chain.
Yeah.
You said it end to end, and that to, you know, origin, and to the consumer's consumer, right?
Absolutely.
So towards the end.
I mean, I was writing for 19 years before I got my first #1. And interestingly, I got my first #1 and then I got 2 during lockdown. And during lockdown, people kept saying, how did you get a #1? Was it the book that just appealed during lockdown? I said, no, it's because the people in the warehouse did their job well. And it genuinely was. If those people had not been getting the books, still going into work, and it was dangerous, you know, they had to do all the sort of social distancing and all those things that we were all concerned about, still went into work and they got books off the huge shelves into the right vans, and off they went to the shops, and then people unpacked them in supermarkets and such, and they could be bought. And that's how it became a bestseller, you know, because people are doing the jobs well.
Fantastic, lovely. All right, so Adele is an ambassador of National Literacy Trust and the Reading Agency. These are the 2 charities that promote literacy in the UK. Adele, what's your point of view, I mean, given your charitable interests and, you know, the widening participation and literacy, I mean,
yeah,
so
both of those charities I've been working with, one for about 10 years and one for about 15. And both of them particularly concentrate on literacy in the UK, because actually, as a Western country that's had free education for well over 100 years, you would think our literacy levels would be some of the highest in the world, and they're not. They're actually quite surprisingly low in lots of parts of the UK. Last set of research that I remember reading and absorbing said that we had 6 million adults with a reading age of about 12-year-old. So, to quote teachers, could do better. But so why is that? And it's not a blame game. Nobody wants to have missed out on education. Nobody wants to have missed the joy of reading. But sometimes life is that way, and people have perhaps been sick and missed time at school, didn't get diagnosed with dyslexia, perhaps they needed glasses and they didn't have them, so they lost the love of schooling quite early on, and then they might have sort of fallen out of the system, and they think reading's not for them. And I think that's a real shame, because personally I think reading brings all sorts of things to our world, and in an enriching way. I'm all about the ease in this particular little bit of my thinking. So obviously, reading is educational. And for some of us, anyone here at the university, they're going to go, well, yes, we love education. But for others, that's really off-putting. But for all, you know, it is educational. If you read, your vocabulary increases, therefore your power increases. Because if you can articulate your needs and wants better, then you are more likely to be a successful human being, because you are going to get out of life what you want, or you are more likely to. So reading is educational. Reading increases empathy. That's not just my thought. That is actually, research has shown that reading increases empathy. It's not a big leap to understand why. When you read, you automatically inhabit the shoes of another person, another character, sometimes several characters. Sometimes people in very different situations to you, maybe a different gender, a different sexuality, a different timeline, a different country, a different race. There's all sorts of different ways of inhabiting the shoes of somebody else. And I would hope, and I know, that reading then makes you think, okay, I see that there's more in common than we have that distance us. And that's a really brilliant thing. And then the third thing, which I think is the lighter part of reading, but for me possibly the most important, is it's just entertaining. Reading is like putting the TV on. I know not everybody believes me, but it really is. You go into this world of stories where you can take yourself out of your own world, you can allow your imagination to flow, you can forget your own concerns and worries for a little while. And it is like a magic carpet. I mean, I remember loving magic books when I was a child. I loved kind of Enid Blyton, Magic Faraway Tree, The Wishing Chair, all the things that took you into a different world. And I believe all books can do that for us. So I think I've been gifted these amazing things because I read a lot. And they've changed my world. You know, I'm really incredibly lucky. So my mission, I guess, is to give that gift to as many of the people as I possibly can. So by working with the National Literacy Trust and the Reading Agency, there are some really specific programs that are so clever that are quite small nudges to increase people's love of reading, the joy of reading. And just some that actually happen here in Teesside I'll name because they're interesting. So recently, the Reading Agency did one. They have, and they had this for about 15 years. Every year they produce a little series of maybe 6 books, very slim books, called Quick Reads. And they're relatively easy access books. The vocabulary's relatively limited. It's good if it's second language. It's good if you're just getting back into the joy of reading. It's good if you are not a confident reader. And they're now doing a program actually in this area where they give those out to homeless people so that, first of all, they get to read a book. But importantly, the back of that book, there are lists of all sorts of help that you can get, sort of where you can go to get online, where you can go to get food and clothes and help, social help, where you can go to get somebody that can give you a free haircut or toothpaste, or, you know, really practical things at the back of a book. But if you haven't got reading skills, you're never going to know you have the right to those things. So that's just a really simple project that comes through the Reading Agency. Another one that the National Literacy Trust, they look more at children's reading, actually. We work a lot with schools across the entire nation, but again, thinking of programs we've got here in the Northeast. One of them is we go into schools and we get authors into schools and we get kids writing their own books and all those exciting things. We talk to teenagers when they're just losing their love of reading because, you know, video games are fun and all that. But even little things like we go into hospitals where there might be a premature baby. And if you've had a premature baby and it's touch and go, life and death, it's very traumatic for you, it's traumatic for the baby. Some parents have said they freeze with their babies, they don't know what to do. So we take books into them and get them to read to their babies because the baby hearing the parent's voice is very good for the baby, health-wise, gives the parents something to do. It takes a level of awkwardness out of, let's face it, a shockingly traumatic and often grieving stage. It's just a really simple thing of providing those books because if a child goes into hospital, you might not think, oh, I must pack a book. And so it's just helping on that kind of level. So there's all sorts of very little projects. I would recommend people go and look up both their websites and see how they can get involved. They do some really fun things. I have found myself sort of, you know, abseiling down very tall buildings to fundraise for them and some strange things. But yeah, they do some fun things.
Tremendous. I mean, fantastic. Thank you for doing all that, and the contributions are immense. And as you said it, right? So, if I may say 3 E's, right? So you said that reading is it's about education, it's about empathy, and the third one is it's about entertainment, right? So it's fantastic, and the way you connected all these 3 E's together, it's beautiful.
Thank
right?
you.
All right. So we talked about a good story. We talked about the writer's perspective, writer's blog, creative writing. We talked about your charitable interests, right? Tell us a few things about how do you see this industry, the publishing industry, right? So let's start with let's say self-publishing. What do you see? What's your perspective on this?
So
self-publishing.
I've been writing now for quarter of a century, which is shocking because it really ages me. But I have been writing for a quarter of a century, so I've seen a lot of change in the industry. And one of them, say, let's talk about self-publishing. 23-4 years ago when I started, self-publishing was called vanity publishing. And people thought, oh, if you can't get a real book deal with one of the publishers, whether that, HarperCollins or whoever it might be, then you publish it yourself, and you probably have to have a lot of money to do that. So you're vain and you're wasting your money. And it was sort of looked down on, and there was quite a snobbery about it. And it was seen as second tier, very much, a big gap and then a second tier. But that's really old-fashioned now, and it's very changed. Now, because technology has changed, our views have changed, we're a much more egalitarian society now than we were 25 years ago. I think we now look at self-publishing and think, well, hang on, are the gatekeepers the right people? And have they any right to be gatekeepers anyhow? And will they ever let me in? And if they won't, is there anything else I can do? And a lot of people have said, yeah, I could self-publish, because now you can quite cheaply, relatively easily self-publish, and you retain creative control, editorial control, you can design your own covers, you can decide how much you want to spend on advertising, etc. So many writers I respect have gone that route. Many people do it as a step on the ladder to eventually get a more traditional publishing contract. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey, that's famous for, first it was self-published, and then somebody noticed it and gave them a contract, and at one time about 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was everywhere, and she sold millions. I think there's a double-edged sword to self-publishing.
There's a flip side,
yeah, there's a flip side. So I think it's so positive for that sort of allowing yourself your own creative freedom and allowing yourself to pursue what you want to pursue. You want to see your book, you might want to give it to your children, you might, that might be the only goal you've got. You might not want to give up your own day job and become a full-time writer anyhow. But there is a flip side, which is there is no quality control. And if you're in a traditional publishing contract, like I am, somebody somewhere will say, oh, hang on, that's not the correct syntax, that's not the correct grammar, you spelt this wrong, they'll fix things. And I think that's important, because they are the tools of the trade, and that's the way we retain respect for what we do. So I would say, if you are going to self-publish, don't fall into the trap of producing something that's a little bit makeshift. It's very easy to get freelance copywriters, freelance editors. Invite people into your circle. Don't think you're a one-person show, because as I explained in an earlier question, I don't think I'm a one-person show. I think I'm part of a big orchestra. I'm not a band. I'm not a one-person band. I'm part of a big orchestra. And so if I was self-publishing, I would have somebody else design my website, somebody else design my cover. I would have other opinions, because, you don't want to become jack of all trades, master of none.
That's it, right? So that's that's a balanced argument. In terms of the pros and cons of self-publishing,
Yeah.
and you described it very well in terms of the fallouts that we should be looking for, and at the same time the benefits that we can have. Apart from self-publishing, what do you see the trends for the publishing industry, right? So, for
Yeah.
example, e-books, audiobooks, but that's just the beginning. But and again, ChatGPT and all that artificial intelligence coming in,
There's
and
so
the world is
much.
changing, right? So
It is
what kind of
changing,
insights
and we're a
do
really
you think?
old-fashioned industry. You know, as industries go, I mean, it makes it
Proudly so, yeah.
absolutely charming and really pleasant to work in, but it is a relatively old-fashioned industry, and there are some people that are really trying to push forward and keep up, at least keep up with the change, but the really good ones are trying to get ahead of the change, because honestly, if you know, you have to evolve. Evolving is essential to survival. We all, scientists know that, you know, everybody knows that really.
Evolution theory, yeah.
So my publishing house, HarperCollins, that's, we put a lot of time and energy into looking at things like audiobooks and ebooks, and what other ways books might sell other than the traditional physical books. It is sort of held back a little bit, in my opinion, by the industry, in so much as the top 10 chart that I told you about, the Sunday Times top 10, that is only a measure of physical books. So if you're a number one top 10 bestseller in the Sunday Times, that's only if you've sold X amount of physical books. Now, I've had weeks where I've sold X amount of physical books, but I've sold more ebooks or more audiobooks, but nobody knows. Nobody knows, except my publisher and me, but it doesn't go into any kind of public domain. People are, as a whole, are not valuing it yet. And I think that's a shame, because actually how we consume our media is changing all the time. Having a device that you can read on electronically is so convenient for so many people. A lot of us, I did a car journey for 5 hours today. I listened to an audiobook. It was just marvelous, a way of consuming fiction. But, you know, driving's a good use of time. All of us are very aware that time is the most valuable asset we have. Everybody, that's true of everybody on this planet. And so understanding that is part of what I think the industry needs to do. And I'm very lucky, because I'm in I believe, a cutting edge publishing house that does address that and wants to address that. So I think that's important. There are other trends that are happening. There's always trends in what readers want. And I don't think that can ever be underestimated. It's quite often to do with what's going on globally. So when we're feeling, this is just my, I don't know the phrase for it, sort of my tin pot theories, right? there's no research to this one, this is just me. But my theory is, when the world is feeling very buoyant and the economy is booming and life's great, people love a bit of a thriller. They really do. They don't mind scaring themselves, because generally they feel pretty safe. And interestingly, when things are a bit grim and difficult, people start thinking, oh, you know what? I'd quite like to read a romance right now. I want to read something a bit more gentle, something a little bit more positive. So you do see different trends in different markets of what people want to read. And yeah, so that's another sort of trend that it's worth keeping an eye on. I mean, I don't think that's the job of a writer. I think writers should write the stories they want, and then readers will find them. But I do see that readers start to say, oh no, I don't want to read anything scary unless I know it's all going to be okay at the end. My life's hard enough. You know, there are times in your life when you want to be comforted, and there's times in your life when you want to be challenged. So I think that's another trend that happens. You mentioned sort of artificial intelligence, because there is a very scary phenomenon that's happening where books can be written, where you sort of say, write a book about somebody dropping a glass of water on the stage and standing on it, and what would happen in an Adele Parks novel after that. Yeah. And that can be generated. I would argue nobody can see inside my mind, and they wouldn't be able to get it right without a lot of in-depth programming. But you know, that is happening, and it is getting better and better, and we can't pretend it's not happening. So I think it's another case of the authors have to find a way of offering added value beyond actually just the words on the page. What else in the creative process do they offer? Which I I hope I do by things like these talks, by my creative thoughts, by passing on recommendations, the sort of thing. But yeah, it's just a case of being aware of trends, being aware of change, not being afraid of it, looking it in the eye and going, okay, are you good for me? What can I do with you? How can I get ahead of you? And even if you look at it even if you look at change as an opponent, there's no point running from your opponent. You know, you've got to face it.
Right, fantastic, smashing, right? Great. All right, so last but not the least, before we, this is a fantastic conversation and we can carry on, but what's the next book or books that you're working on and you'll be releasing? So it's like 22 books in 22 years.
Yes.
And this is
now 2023.
So 2023 is 23rd book, right?
Yeah,
so,
and that's my plan. I mean, it's quite unusual, really, I think, to have done 22 books, 22 years, all times top 10 bestsellers. And other types of top 10 bestsellers I can now tell you about. Amazon, you know, the audio charts and all those other things, ebook reading charts. But my next one comes out in July, and it is another psychological thriller, which is a genre I'm really enjoying writing in. My psychological thrillers tend to be set in quite a domestic situation, and they do offer my reader, I think, a sense of resolve. This one is called Just Between Us, which doesn't mean you have to keep it between us. You can tell everybody about it.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, right? Because we're trying to break the news here, right? So
yeah, no, tell everybody.
Okay, right.
It's interesting. It's been a really big creative challenge, this book, because it is a book that you can read as a continuation from my book, Both of You, or you can read it standalone. So if you've never read any of my books, you can come to this and just read it. But if you have read, not last book, the book before, book that was 2021, both of you, 2021, Both of You, it's a continuation from that. Now, I never expected to write a continuation of Both of You. When I wrote it, I thought I was done with it and finished. But it did have an ambiguous ending, which is quite unusual for me. And the ambiguous ending, I believe, came from the fact I wrote it during lockdown. I think I was playing with my creativity in a little bit different way. And when we read it here in the UK and in Australia and many of my other European markets, everybody was sort of like, thank you, right? I've read the book and they've reacted to it and they liked the twists and turns and they enjoyed the book. When it got launched in America, the Americans en masse, literally hundreds, maybe thousands, of messages saying, no, you cannot leave it like that. You must tell us what happens to these families, what's next. So I thought, okay, if you want it that much, I will. So I wasn't ready to write it straight away. I wrote one last secret in between, and now I've written Just Between Us. And it is the next stage of what happened to the people in Both of You. But I had to, as I say, write it as an independent standalone. But I didn't want to repeat information, so it was boring if you had read the first one. So it's really challenging. But I loved it all the more for that, actually. And my editor says, and I hope she's telling the truth, she said she thinks it's my best yet. So I would love to think it is my best yet. Right. So that comes out in July. I will be up in the region again to promote the book when that comes out. And in fact, I'm doing my launch event in the little town of Yarm. So yeah, in one of the Waterstones in Yarm. Yeah. So that will be really good fun. And yeah, so that's that one. And that means I'm already sort of halfway through writing book 2024.
24th one.
Yes, yes.
Okay. You plan really well.
Yeah, I do.
Right,
that, and actually, I've already in my head got book 25. I know what I'm writing.
Tremendous.
And so I know I always have that. It makes me feel secure. I am officially, I think, self-diagnosed, but officially a workaholic. It makes me feel quite comfortable, but also quite excited, knowing, oh, this is next, and this is going to be fun, and I've got to research is always great fun. So the idea of sort of researching the next book is really exciting.
Beautiful, right? Wish you all the very best.
Thank you so
with
much.
2023, this
Yes.
July release,
Yes.
as well as the upcoming ones.
Thank
we're
you.
pretty excited. And thank you so much for taking out time for this interview. It was a
Absolute pleasure.
to have you on the In Conversation show.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the conversation. I'm your host Mansoor Soomro, and I'll see you in another episode with another amazing guest.